Former Chicago police detective Joseph Fragoli was never tested for alcohol the night in 2008. He ran a stop sign and T-boned a squad car after a 6-hour visit to an Indiana casino. Although one of the injured officers noticed Fragoli's eyes were glassy, the veteran homicide detective was placed in his sergeant's squad car, handed 2 minor traffic tickets, and driven home before he was ever even questioned. A little over a year later, Fragoli had a blood alcohol content about 4 times the legal limit when his SUV plowed into a disabled vehicle on the Dan Ryan Expressway in April 2009, killing 2 young men trapped in the fiery wreckage. By the time a state trooper arrived at the hospital to arrest Fragoli, a high-ranking Chicago police official acting as street deputy that night was already there, and prevented Fragoli from making any statements. Mr. Fragoli sat up and said, "I wasn't driving. Did you find the other guy?" Trooper Garrett Lindroth testified this week in federal court. The street deputy put a hand on Fragoli's shoulder and told him to be quiet and just let the trooper do his job. Whether Fragoli was protected by his fellow cops is at the center of a wrongful death lawsuit filed by the families of the 2 men who perished in the 2009 crash, Andrew Cazares and Fausto Manzera. The suit alleges the police department's so-called code of silence led Fragoli to believe that he could drink and drive with impunity. The city has denied that any code of silence influenced Fragoli's decisions that night and argues that taxpayers should not be on the hook because the crash occurred while he was off duty. On Thursday, Fragoli, brought from prison, where he is serving an 8-year sentence for an aggravated DUI conviction in the fatal 2009 wreck, took the witness stand and denied he felt he could get away with driving drunk because of his status as a police officer. He said he'd seen fellow officers get fired and go to prison for it, and that no one was above the law. Dressed in a white polo shirt and wearing glasses, Fragoli, 50, testified calmly for about 2 hours in U.S. District Judge Virginia Kendall's courtroom, occasionally sipping from a cup of water as attorneys for the victims asked him repeatedly about his problems with alcohol and history of traffic crashes. He said he started drinking when he was a teenager, and by the time he was in his 30s, he would regularly consume up to 20 drinks in a day, typically Miller Lite beer, supplemented by Jaeger bomb shots, a mix of Jägermeister liqueur and Red Bull. He frequented well-known cop-friendly bars like Shinnick's Pub in Bridgeport, Dugan's on Halsted Street in the Greektown neighborhood, and 115 Bourbon Street in Marionette Park, often drinking with other detectives from the Wentworth area. Fragoli testified he never drove drunk. In fact, he said, the 2009 fatal crash was the first time he had done so, to the best of my knowledge. Still, Fragoli testified he knew he had a problem. In 2007, he requested a transfer to the overnight shift so that bars would close before he could drink too much. Since the crash that killed Cazares and Manzera, he hasn't had a drop, he said. Much of his testimony focused on 2 crashes that occurred 24 hours apart in January 2008. In the first, Fragoli lost control of his unmarked Crown Victoria while on duty and struck a concrete barrier at 47th and Wells Streets. Fragoli testified that it was cold and snowy that morning and his car had simply slipped on a patch of ice. A sergeant came to the scene and the car was towed, but no sobriety tests were given and no further investigation was done. About 9 p.m. that day, Fragoli went to Harrah's Casino in Whiting and played blackjack for about 6 hours, he testified. Although he acknowledged that Harrah's serves drinks, Fragoli said he had no alcohol at all while he was there. At about 3:30 a.m., he was driving home in his BMW when he broadsided a Chicago police squad car on West 37th Street in Bridgeport. Just a few blocks from his home, records show. The force of the crash pushed the squad car into a light pole and injured both officers, one seriously. Fragoli blamed the crash on distracted driving. "I applied the brake, my cell phone went sliding," Fragoli testified. "When I reached for it, I went through the stop sign and I hit the squad car. One of the injured officers testified in Fregoli's sentencing hearing in 2012 that his eyes were glassy and that he appeared dumbfounded at the scene. But officers called there to investigate never spoke to Fregoli directly or administered any intoxication tests because the same sergeant who had responded to Fregoli's crash the day before, Stacy Smith Cotter, allowed Fregoli to sit in her squad car and told the officers she saw no signs of impairment. Records show investigating officers ticketed the detective for running a stop sign and handed the citation to the sergeant, who then drove Fregoli home. Neither officer was ever notified of Fregoli's court date, and the allegations were dismissed. Records show in April 2009, Fregoli had spent hours drinking at 115 Bourbon Street in Dugans when he got behind the wheel of his Lexus SUV, entered the southbound Dan Ryan at a high rate of speed, and slammed into the back of the victim's car near Roosevelt Road, where they had pulled over because of a flat tire. Fregoli was pulled from the wreckage by a Good Samaritan and limped away on a ramp, bleeding from the head as the vehicle he'd struck burst into flames. He was arrested by Chicago police officers near Clinton Street and Roosevelt after a tow truck driver spotted him and cut off his path. Fregoli was taken to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where he refused to submit to a blood draw. According to testimony, he was later forced by law to submit to testing, and his blood alcohol level was measured at 0.328%, more than 4 times the legal limit of 0.08%. While at the hospital, Fregoli repeated to both a nurse and Lindroth, the investigating state trooper, that he was not the driver of the car. According to testimony, Lindroth also said he found it unusual that a high-ranking street deputy for the Chicago police was with Fregoli at the hospital telling him what to do. Fregoli was off duty and we didn't notify Chicago police that their help was needed, the trooper testified. Jim Eisner at ChicagoTribune.com. Twitter @Jameter22B